Hey everyone! This video is about the thoughts and emotions that transgender people often repress before transitioning, and how that plays into sexual fetishes and personal relationships and other identity issues. So yes, I am going to be talking about sexual fetishes, but none of it will be explicit. I'm going to be focusing more on thoughts and emotions rather than anatomy, and I'm not going to go into detail about explaining all of these different kinks. So this video will be pretty tame, even by sex ed standards. When we are born, we are assigned a gender, and that comes with a lot of baggage, regardless of whether or not you're trans. The letter on your birth certificate determines how society treats you and what society expects from you. And in most cases, it will determine the role that you are expected to play throughout your life. Because we are given this role as a child, it is likely to be one that we're going to continue playing regardless of whether or not it makes sense for your identity. Gender roles, gender stereotypes, and the segregation of boys and girls at a young age helps reinforce the notion that the quote-unquote other gender is exotic or taboo in some way. This is especially true for people who are assigned male at birth due to toxic masculinity and misogyny. Obviously, this depends on the environment that you grew up in, but from what I've seen, a girl who acts more masculine is considered strong or admirable in some way, while a boy who acts more feminine is considered deviant. But regardless of your gender, breaking stereotypes and societal norms is frowned upon. And it reinforces the idea that being anything other than the prime example of your gender is taboo. This can lead to the repression of gender-related thoughts, and it makes it a lot harder to discuss issues like gender dysphoria, even before considering that most people don't really know anything about trans people. One of the most common misconceptions that trans people develop is that they think all people actually want to be the quote-unquote opposite gender. I believe this too, and as someone who didn't learn about transition until adulthood, I just treated my desire to transition as a fantastical idea, like how many furries would have a fun time being a real anthro animal. When I got together with my partner, I told him about these funny thoughts I had, and he told me that he never wanted to be a girl. He said, "I have always wanted to be very man as I can." What certainly doesn't help trans people is the idea of autogynephilia, which describes trans women as men who are just sexually aroused by the idea of being a woman. Note that the theory is used to describe trans women, not trans men or trans masculine non-binary people, so it's trans misogyny. And it reinforces toxic male stereotypes as well. This line of thinking says a lot more about our society than it does about trans people. As a trans person who was raised to be a gender that I'm not, believe me when I say that there was nothing sexy about the character I used to play as. Society's management of gender leads to repression, and this may manifest itself as a gender-bending fetish. I used to gender bend my OCs from before I left the fandom, and I feel embarrassed about it now because this behavior was rooted in self-ignorance and repression. It's like the idea of me transitioning got pushed outside of the realm and reason and into the world of sexual fantasy. I think this is also why transformation fetishes end up being very popular, because it's rooted in a desire to change one's form. There are also two main categories of activities that some trans women participate in before they transition. The first is cross-dressing and drag performance, and the second is the sissy or feminization fetish. Many trans women start off discovering themselves in these spaces, in the same way that I was exploring my identity with fetish material. Even when I was getting my gender dysphoria diagnosis, I was asked about my experiences with cross-dressing, of which I had none. Acquiring and storing physical items like this is much harder than just viewing some artwork online. And even if my living situation was conducive to these activities, I think that cross-dressing would have just highlighted the insecurities I had with my body. Gendered clothing fits differently, and I think that the discrepancies would have made me feel more like a parody of my gender. I mean, even after a few months on hormones, none of the pants that I used to wear would actually fit me anymore. What makes me feel uncomfortable about these spaces is that they're often framed as activities for men, while the fetishes that I ended up exploring myself with were gender neutral. However, while I can't personally relate, I still do appreciate that these activities help trans people explore their identities. Having a strong identity is so important. When your sense of self is skewed, it also skews the other aspects of your life, such as your ability to relate to and interact with other people. I started to suspect that I was into guys 1 or 2 years before I realized that I was trans. So I thought that I might be quote-unquote gay at the time. However, I still had this nagging feeling that it didn't really fit. And what it came down to is that being a guy who's with a guy who's into guys is completely different from being a girl who's with a guy who's into girls. Your sexual orientation determines who you are attracted to, but you yourself as a person are still part of the relationship. I sensed this fundamental disconnect even before recognizing my gender issues. But not everyone does. There are cases where trans people report their sexual orientation switching after transition. This is more common in non-heterosexual trans people than it is in heterosexual trans people. Gay conversion therapy has taught us that you can't modify your sexual orientation, but it's possible for someone to not fully understand their sexuality. This is especially true for trans people because we have an inherent dissociation of having to play a role. More specifically, it is very easy to mistake admiration or jealousy for attraction, especially if you haven't actually experienced true romantic attraction before. In retrospect, every time I thought I had a crush on a girl in high school, it was just because I wanted to be more like them. This leads to some trans people deciding to live vicariously through a romantic partner because they weren't told that transition is possible, or because they were told too late and didn't want to give up the life that they built. Obviously, this is a sunk cost fallacy, but it is difficult to decide to dissociate yourself from the identity that you held for several decades. Memories that now feel tainted, decisions that you wish you would have done differently, and experiences that you now have to acknowledge that you missed out on. This was an easy decision for me because I felt like I had nothing to lose. I was already thinking of it as an all or nothing type deal, and then when I nearly died, it just reaffirmed that I had to transition no matter what. I imagine it's a lot harder if you already have an education or career or family. My main takeaway from this video is that it's important to understand who you are. Repressed thoughts can leak out in sexual fetishes that you may end up feeling embarrassed about later. And just in general, your identity colors all aspects of your life. It affects your experiences, the decisions that you make, and how you relate to other people. When you go through life without knowing who you are, you end up paying for it later. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and let me know any comments if you had repressed thoughts or identity issues that made you do a silly thing too. Hope to see you around. Bye!